It's time for Real Estate 101 with the Carrie Brown team from Realty Executives Preferred Advisors.
Good Sunday morning to you. This is Carrie Brown, broker owner of Realty Executives Preferred Advisors, and you're listening to Real Estate 101. Today I am here with Patrick Vogelsburg and Kathy Minden, and they are with the Kansas Association of Realtors. Patrick, what is your role with the Kansas Association of Realtors?
Well, I'm the Vice President of Governmental Affairs for the Kansas Association of Realtors, and pretty much this time of the year, I serve as the association's State House lobbyist. So I'm up at the State House here in Topeka every day and spend my time testifying on various pieces of legislation and interacting with our state's lawmakers on behalf of realtors, homeowners, and property owners.
Most people don't realize why that is so important. So let's just let's do some education there. So what would you say are the big issues that we're facing right now? Well,
the legislature every January through roughly May, sometimes even into June, they meet and they're considering various pieces of legislation that are brought before them in the various committees. These are introduced by various interest groups on behalf of membership organizations such as ours, constituents, and even some lawmakers may introduce legislation that is a specific interest to them. So, as we like to say, decisions are going to get made at the State House whether you show up or not, and we want to be part of that discussion with home ownership being and property ownership really being the cornerstone of American society. We want to make sure that homeowners and our members are front of mind, and the issues that they find important, such as property rights and tax issues, are front of mind, and that lawmakers are considering that because many times what I'm doing whenever there's a piece of legislation is I'm trying to educate lawmakers on how it's going to affect homeowners and my members, but also, probably more importantly, point out the unintended consequences that we see potentially happening to the housing market, to property rights, that maybe the lawmakers who are not coming from that same background, that same worldview as ours, we can point that out to them, and they can take that into consideration.
And, that stands to reason. We often look at things from our point of view, and we don't often think our way through the whole process. Who else does it affect, and how? Everybody loves taxes, right? So what are the big issues right now going on with taxes that you're facing?
So I think most of your listeners probably appreciate that there was significant federal tax reform that was passed at the end of 2017. President Trump signed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and it was the first comprehensive tax reform that we've seen at the federal level since the mid-'80s. In that, there were significant provisions dealing with tax incentives or preferred tax policies for home ownership. And some of those have a direct impact on homeowners, and though the impact may be felt differently across the country. So, for instance, the mortgage interest deduction, there was ultimately a cap put in on the amount of mortgage debt. That cap was $750,000. There was also a cap on the state and local tax deduction, what's known as the SALT deduction, at $10,000. Now, those two provisions, I think for us here in the Midwest and Kansas, may not have as large of an impact as what it would be in, say, California or the Northeast, New York, New Jersey. But the provision that will have an impact for state-level taxes has to do with the doubling of the standard deduction. So with the doubling of the standard deduction for singles, that went up to $12,000, and for joint filers, that went up to $24,000. So a good break for a lot of taxpayers regardless of whether or not you rent or own a home. But for Kansas tax filers, looking at your Kansas tax return, in Kansas law, you are only allowed to itemize if you itemize at the federal level. And so with the doubling of the standard deduction, the overwhelming majority of Kansans will not itemize because they'll get the benefit of the doubling. And so as that plays down to the Kansas level income tax return, they'll lose their state level deductions, which are charitable deductions, property tax deduction, mortgage interest, and then coming back just here this last year is the medical deduction. We estimate that 90% of those that, 90% of tax filers will not qualify for the state level itemized deductions. And that's a very significant piece for us because, we feel that home ownership is preferred in our society. There's a lot of benefits not only to the individuals that own homes, to the communities. Having a stable housing market is crucial for stable and economically stable communities. And being preferred, we feel that it should have a preferred place in our policies and especially our tax policies. So back to the Kansas law that says you can only itemize in Kansas if you itemize federally. What we want to do is change that law and say, regardless of whether or not you itemize federally, you can still take these state level itemized deductions. And so that's simply what the legislation does. So with that, there is some fiscal effects that it has on the state, and I'm happy to go into those.
Sure, I think that would be great for the public to know.
Yeah, so earlier in the legislative session, so if the fiscal impact is if more people are on the state level income tax, if the majority of people are losing their income tax deductions and not benefiting from that and retaining those tax dollars, then those tax dollars are going to go to the state. And so the state stands to see an increase in revenue off of those income taxes coming in due to the loss of the deductions. And so that's been kind of the back and forth this legislative session is, one, estimating, just how much money are we talking about for the state, and whether or not the state should realize really what is a cash windfall from federal tax reform or not, or should they send those tax dollars back to the taxpayers. We feel that federal tax reform, for all of its purposes, was really supposed to be a tax cut for most Americans. And it wasn't intended to just simply be a tax shift down to the state. And the loss, if the legislature does nothing, I think that's really what we see, is that tax shift going on, because people may be having less of a tax liability federally, but they're going to see an increase in their state income tax liability through the loss of the deductions. Now, there is so anytime the state is seeing this money, this potential money, they are faced with the dilemma of, do we proactively pass legislation to fix this issue and get the money back to the taxpayers, or do we do nothing and maybe use it for other purposes? And as you know, the state has had several years of very, very tight revenue and budget. The situation's been very tight as far as the budget goes. And last year passed significant income tax increases after years of lowering income tax. They passed significant income tax increases last year to get the state's fiscal situation to improve. Now, if they do nothing and don't allow Kansans to itemize regardless of federal filing, this is an additional income tax increase on Kansas homeowners. And it's really a hidden income tax increase because the legislature isn't going to vote for this tax increase. They can just realize the increased revenue through doing nothing. And so what we're telling lawmakers is this is an income tax increase if you don't do anything. It's a hidden income tax increase. And if you're going to have that sort of discussion on tax policy, it needs to be out and open, and the public needs to be aware that it's coming. And part of the reason why we're so happy to be here today is to let your listeners know that this is an issue that's out there. And for those that enjoy the tax relief of the Kansas itemized deductions, they're very much at risk right now if we don't see legislation passed this session.
And, I don't think that there's probably a whole lot of, when it comes to taxes, people kind of glaze over, They just don't see the relevance, or they think, well, I don't have a say in it. As Kansas homeowners or patrons or residents anyway, you really need to know what's impacting you because this is a big deal.
Yeah. I think a lot of taxpayers, myself maybe included, don't necessarily think of my potential tax liability until I'm sitting there across the table from my tax preparer, crossing my fingers.
Yeah.
Crossing my fingers and hoping it turns out good. But for those Kansans that have grown accustomed to itemizing at the federal level and at the state level, and have adjusted their withholdings or have the expectation that, I know I'm going to owe this much at the end of the year, or I'm expecting this amount of a refund, the loss of all of these deductions could result in a difference, $300 to $600, for the average taxpayer. So it could be something, and and that amount, $300, $400, $500, $600, a difference in tax liability. I don't know if there's a homeowner around that, if asked, hey, what would you do with this extra $500? Do you have any projects? Would you replace the refrigerator or put new tires on the car? Tackle one of these projects or do whatever.
Or just leave it with the state.
Right. Or do you want to just leave it at the state? And in all those things, again, kind of going back to home ownership and being an economic driver, those are all things that are providing dollars back into the economy. And homeowners definitely are, they invest a lot, not only in the real estate, but then they spend a lot of dollars maintaining that investment through the purchase of goods and services that are all positive indicators or have positive impact on the state's economy.
So where is this and of course I have a hard time saying this word, where is the legislation at in the legislative process?
Yeah, it's always a kind of a tongue tie there. So this bill has been in a couple different pieces of legislation, actually in bill form, and there have been hearings on both the House and Senate Tax Committee. So there's three bills, and I'll just kind of talk to the issue generally, because at this time in the legislative session, you see contents of bills kind of change into different bill numbers. Bills are amended into other bills and such, which is kind of just par for the course this time of the legislative session. So this legislation recently passed in a tax package out of the Kansas Senate, and it was a bundle of tax policies in Senate substitute for House Bill 2228. Anyways, it passed, and this provision, in kind of a unique procedural way, the Senate, when they took it up, they divided the bill up and took each piece individually. And on the portion of the bill that passed or deals with itemized deductions and allowing Kansans to itemize regardless of their federal itemizer standard deduction selection. That piece passed the Senate overwhelmingly in the bill, and then the underlying bill also passed. So right now, the legislation is kind of in the House of Representatives court. The Senate has passed their version. They have a strong position on it. So right now, there's a couple different ways in which this could get forward. Likely, probably one of the more common ways is for this bill to go to a conference committee where House and Senate negotiators will get together, talk about the bill, and try to come up with a compromise, and then that compromise would need to run on both the House and Senate floor. There is another option because the House Tax Committee had this bill, and they passed it out of committee favorably, and it's sitting on the House General Orders. It hasn't been scheduled for a debate yet. But they could also bring up their version, which is just this piece of legislation and not the bundle of other tax policies that the Senate kicked out. So there is a possibility that they could schedule their own bill for a debate. So really, in either one of those scenarios, the Senate has taken up this piece, they've passed it, and really it's for the House of Representatives to take it up.
Southwest Topeka has a good neighbor. State Farm agent Jim Garrison, now at 29th and Urish. If your current insurance situation has you going around in circles, get off the roundabout and stop in and meet Jim and his wonderfully efficient staff. Let Jim Garrison give you a quote and make the Garrison comparison. He's confident that with State Farm's competitive rates, the right coverage, and his unmatched service, you'll want to make him your new insurance agent. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there, and Jim Garrison is there for you, northeast of the roundabout at 29th and Urish.
This is Stephen Parkin at Invista Credit Union. Purchasing a home is one of the most exciting and important decisions someone can make. Let me tell you why Invista is the best choice for financing your new home purchase. First, quick pre-approval process. Our fast decision-making gives you the power to act quickly and make an offer on your dream home. Second, local servicing. We service your mortgage in-house. You won't get a long-distance runaround, but a committed professional whose only job is to help you. Third, experienced team. We are dedicated to simplifying the process and educating you through the home buying process. Come by Invista. It's okay to dream. In fact, it's encouraged. We are your home buying partner. Give us a call at 785-228-0149.
Thanks for joining us again. And I am back with Patrick Vogelsburg and Kathy Minden with the Kansas Association of Realtors. And we were just talking about a bill that's being passed, or legislation that's being potentially before to be passed that could definitely affect Kansas homeowners. Are there any other issues that are impacting the legislation being passed?
Yeah. So, this time of the year, we're getting into the closing segment of the legislative session. And no one piece is immune from being impacted by other pieces of legislation being considered. And this legislative session, the number one issue that the legislature has been trying to grapple with has been school finance. Currently, our Kansas school finance funding formula has been held unconstitutional by the Kansas Supreme Court. And the legislature has been spending time this session trying to come up with a remedy to that school finance funding structure that would satisfy the Kansas Supreme Court. Without going into kind of the legal complexities of it, the end result is that the legislature will need to spend more money, put more money towards K-12 education. And there is an ongoing policy and philosophical debates that are going back and forth up the Kansas State House. At the end of the day, more money is going to be spent on K-12, and that money's got to come from somewhere, and it's going to come from tax dollars, or it could come from budget cuts elsewhere in the Kansas government. But I don't think anyone's realistically considering those right now. So it's really increasing dollars, and those dollars would come from tax revenue. So with, as I mentioned earlier in the program, with the fiscal impact or the dollars that are at stake, if Kansans lose these deductions, that means there's more dollars going towards Kansas income tax revenue. And those would be more dollars that could be spent on various government budget items, including school finance. So lawmakers, I think what they've been struggling with is with federal tax reform. And there's been it's difficult to quote hard numbers. Those have been somewhat fluid and flexible. But we do know that federal tax reform stands a chance to bring a cash windfall to the state. Now, whether or not that is $50 million more dollars or $150 million more, it's somewhere in the positive range. And so, are lawmakers going to try to capture those dollars and then use them for school finance, or try to get as much of those dollars back to the taxpayers? And so the school finance question, some lawmakers would like to use this itemized deduction piece, use the gain dollars from that and help offset the increased school funding bill. Other lawmakers say, we shouldn't, this is found money that we weren't expecting. And we had no idea that it would even come into play until December 22nd, 2017. So we shouldn't be considering that in our overall revenue for schools. That's a separate tax policy. So right now, where the school funding legislation is at, the legislature has passed a bill. They passed it early morning on, I believe it's April 7th. Passed it out of the legislature somewhat controversially, very, very narrow vote. The governor has signed the bill, and the next step is for that legislation to go to the Kansas Supreme Court for oral arguments here at the end of April. So we'll see if the additional dollars that the legislature has allocated for schools will satisfy the court or not. And we may be back here at the end of the legislative session or in a special session talking about school finance and tax policy once again.
You could see where the lines would be easily blurred. They're looking at a solution to a problem that they have. Mm-hmm. Nobody knew that this money was coming. So maybe if we just kind of sweep that under, nobody's really going to know, and we've solved our problem.
Correct. Yeah. And really, I think that's what, what we've been doing up at the State House is, throwing up the flag and saying, hold on now, this, you're not going to get, past this quietly. We're going to raise the point that if you want to use this money, it is an income tax increase, and your constituents are going to know that. And maybe at the end of the day, they say, okay, fine. But they at least need to be informed that part of the dollars that will go to K-12 education, a portion of that is going to come from the loss of deductions. And what we're saying is, these deductions, there are strong legislative intent over the years that these deductions, this tax relief, be provided to Kansas homeowners. The legislature has had opportunity after opportunity to repeal these deductions. They have given haircuts to them, and they have put them on a path to restoration. It has been over the past 6 years that these have been discussed. And time again, Kansas legislators have always said, we're going to preserve these deductions for homeowners. And now is not the time, I think, to erode years of legislative intent just by quietly doing nothing. Anyways, we're raising the issue up the State House. That's part of our role of being actively engaged, and again, why we're so happy to be a part of this program, so your listeners are aware that this is coming, and they don't wake up in April of 2018 when they're getting ready to file their taxes and say, wait a second, what about my state deductions? Why can't I use those? And then they come to the realization that they can't because they don't itemize federally.
So, Kathy, why are realtors involved in this bill?
Well, first of all, Carrie, thank you for having Patrick and I here. This is very, very important to all homeowners across the state of Kansas. We as realtors believe that private property ownership of real property is the fundamental foundation of our nation's free enterprise system. Particularly, home ownership is the cornerstone of the American dream and deserves a preferred place in our system of values. It contributes to community responsibility, business, civic, and economic stability, family security, and quality of life. We as realtors believe that every family deserves the right to be a property owner. Our members are committed to help every single person, if they're interested, to realize the American dream of home ownership. It's because of these beliefs that realtors strongly support the policies that Patrick has talked about that prioritize private property ownership rights. Private property ownership rights, specifically home ownership rights, deserves a preferred place in our Kansas tax policy. The mortgage interest deduction and the property tax deduction recognize that this is a preferred place, and that it is why the Kansas Association of Realtors is pursuing to preserve these deductions. Very, very important.
And what can our listeners do?
First of all, if you're a homeowner, contact your state legislators. Attend local legislative meetings, coffees, town hall meetings, and tell your legislators locally to preserve these tax deductions. Most of the time, legislators will listen to their constituents, so be involved. If you're unsure about who your legislator is or how to contact them, you can always go to the kansaslegislature.org website. That's KSLEGISTATURE.org, and their contact information will be there. If you're a realtor out there listening to this, be involved in your own communities. Talk to your legislators. Be involved with the coffees and the town meetings. And most importantly, whether you are a homeowner or a realtor, please go out and vote. If you're a realtor, invest in RPAC. RPAC is the Realtor Political Action Committee. We are the Realtor Party. We support property owners' rights. We are not affiliated with any particular party. We support those who support our homeowner.
So the key thing here is get involved. Talk to the people that make these rules or pass these, and just ask questions, because a lot of this is getting swept under the carpet and you're really not being informed. And fortunately, we have people just like you that are going out and trying to bring awareness. Thanks again for listening to Real Estate 101. If you're looking to buy or sell, be sure and give us a call at 785-213-5188.
Thank you for listening to Real Estate 101 with the Carrie Brown team from Realty Executives Preferred Advisors. Tune in again next Sunday at 11 o'clock for Real Estate 101.